Hello everybody and welcome to Every Movie Ever. I am your host Eric and this is the show where we are trying to review every movie ever made. And we're going to start off this week with 50 Shades Freed, the third and final installment in the 50 Shades of Grey trilogy. Now if you're a longtime watcher of the show, you will know that I have, God help me, enjoyed the previous two 50 Shades movies. Now, full disclosure, I do not think I enjoyed them in the way that the producers would have liked me to enjoy them. These are definitely films in the so bad they're good category. And I thought that the first two were a lot of fun to watch. Real dumb, but in a fun way. 50 Shades Freed, however, is the most boring entry in the 50 Shades franchise. Hard to say why. I mean, certainly at the beginning of the movie, they sort of jump the shark and Sam and Diane it by having, at least in as much as a 50 Shades movie could, in having our two lead characters, the impossibly named Christian Grey and Anastasia Steele, get married. The rest of the movie is, yeah, it just doesn't have the pizzazz of the other two. I have heard out on the street that the actors who play Christian and Anastasia do not like each other, and you start to feel that here, as this is the most boring and disaffected entry of the franchise. In a series of movies that are already fairly poorly acted, this one feels the most like the characters are just sort of, you know, walking through the, you know, phoning it in. That, you know, as far as what the movie is, I mean, it's the usual vanilla depictions of what are supposed to be, you know, more, I'm trying to think of how to say it, for a family-friendly program, more extreme adult activities, let's put it that way. Vanilla depictions of extreme adult activities. And like now, 50 Shades Darker, the second entry, introduced the idea of there being like helicopter crashes and weird sorts of vaguely action movie shenanigans in these films. This one ratchets it up a little bit in a bit of the movie that I find both, there's maybe both my favorite and least favorite parts of the movie, because it does ratchet things up to unnecessary extremes, wherein Anastasia's boss, Hyde, who Christian fired in the previous movie for trying to take advantage of Anastasia, he's back for revenge. And in what we understand to be just a couple of days, if not at most a couple of weeks, he has assembled a James Bond level of gadgetry and planning to set out on a kidnapping plot to have his revenge on Mr. and Mrs. Grey. So this is at once the most ridiculous and the most boring entry in the franchise. How they pulled that off, I don't know. Only 50 Shades could do it. As usual, only Dakota Johnson seems to come through these movies with any sort of charm, but she's so sleepwalking through this one that that's not there either. Boring, disaffected, also confusing. It's not like I've seen any of the previous two movies more than the once, so their desire to pull in loose plot threads and random characters from the previous movies is only confusing to me. 50 Shades Freed, 2 stars. Well, folks, I recently decided it was time to revisit that 80s dark comedy classic, Heathers. Now, this is a movie that I'm not sure I've ever seen the whole thing of. This is a movie that I definitely had bought at one point and watched the first half or 2/3 of it. Then something came up and I just never finished watching it. Well, consarn it, I decided it was time to watch the whole thing. And it's a pretty good movie. It's a pretty good movie. It's certainly a dark satire. Winona Ryder stars as a fairly popular, pretty popular high school girl. She's in with the popular clique of girls, all of whom are named Heather. So there are 3 Heathers. And Winona Ryder at the start of the movie is starting to see that their whole mean girl shtick is no good. Add to the pot James Dean-style loner Christian Slater having come to the school. He starts dating Winona Ryder and starts opening her eyes to how bad the Heathers are, and then things get quickly very murdery. Now, this is a movie that in our current climate is kind of an odd one to watch. This is a movie where Christian Slater does bring a gun to school and there are almost no consequences for it. It does remain a dark satire of disaffected youth, and watching Winona figure herself out in it with these exaggerated things going on is still funny at times, but again, the satire, which in the 80s seemed so extreme, hews a little close to home now, which gives the movie both a bizarre prescience, not Precious, that was based on the book Push by Sapphire. No, a strange, I can't say the word. It gives it a forward-looking attitude that you didn't think it would have. The first 2/3 of this movie are really solid, a really sharp satire. The last third kind of goes so far down that dark road and that still can't say it, but it goes so far down that road that it does become a little bit of a difficult watch. Still, it is a solid movie that hopefully in 10 years becomes more watchable again. Let's call Heather's 3.5 stars. Let's talk about Dave. Dave is a movie that previous to this last watching I would have told you I really, really liked. On this most recent revisit, I've got to downgrade it to, yeah, it's good. It is, however, kind of bland. This is the one where Kevin Kline plays both, he does double duty. He plays the President of the United States, and he also plays a man who makes his living impersonating the President of the United States. And when the President goes into a coma, he gets drafted to try and fill in for the President so nobody realizes what's going on. The whole thing sort of stretches credulity. As we are, led to believe that no one would really notice the difference, and also that people in the higher ups of the government would support such a plot, or that it wouldn't get out. The movie is helped in that it's not taking itself super seriously. It's not like a thriller trying to get you to, agree and believe that, oh, this could happen. It's more of a lighthearted romantic comedy, I guess. The romance itself at the center of it is pretty weird. Sigourney Weaver plays the First Lady. We hear it every movie ever. We're big Sigourney Weaver fans. And listen, both she and Kline are turning in typically great performances. But we are expected to believe that Sigourney Weaver has fallen out of love with her husband, but then falls in love with a guy who is impersonating her husband, which she figures out the truth of reasonably early into the movie. So that listen, what I'm saying here is the First Lady has a type, and it's guys that look just like Kevin Kline. It's an all right movie. I think it could stand to lose 10 or 20 minutes. Streamline the whole thing, maybe give us some better excuses. All in all, I'm giving Dave 3 stars. All right, folks, it is time for MST3 A to Z. This is, of course, the part of the show where we are watching every Mystery Science Theater 3000 movie in alphabetical order. Why are we doing this? Because I am a big Mystery Science Theater 3000 fan. And yes, I did just buy my ticket to this fall's Mystery Science Theater live tour, which means this will be the 3rd year in a row I go see these guys live and in person. So that tells you a little something about this guy. In any event, we're going back through the back catalog. We're watching every movie in alphabetical order because, to be honest with you, there's a lot of these episodes I have not seen. We are not reviewing the episodes of the show. We are reviewing the movies themselves. And this week we are talking about Catalina Caper, a rarity for Mystery Science Theater in that this is an honest-to-God comedy movie that they have decided to take on. It is, however, still dull. This is a movie that is trying to capitalize somewhat on the, Frankie and Annette style beach pictures, but with clearly no idea of how to do it. It's a dull movie with no interesting story, no interesting characters to latch on to. It seems to revolve around a desire to retrieve some sort of a treasure map. The whole thing gets both bogged down and saved by the singing and dancing numbers. Inexplicably, Little Richard is in this movie. He's the biggest name that you've got, And the Little Richard the Little Richard song is sort of fun, but overall this movie just tanks and tanks hard. Catalina Caper is only worth 1.5 stars. Ooh, I feel a spooky chill in the theater, gang, which means it must be time for Calling All Horror Hounds. Gang, I have never been big into Poltergeist. It was just never a movie that I watched growing up, even though it was certainly one of the more popular horror movies of the 80s, and given that it was only rated PG, maybe PG-13, certainly a more accessible one, and yet one I never particularly cared to watch. I did finally catch it a couple of years ago, and while I didn't love it, I certainly liked it, which meant that recently it was time to explore the Poltergeist sequels, both of which were featured recently on the new one of those weird HD channels called Comet. I gotta give a big shout out to Comet because I've been enjoying their programming, starting with Poltergeist 2, The Other Side. This is a pretty much direct sequel to Poltergeist, wherein the Poltergeist family has moved in with Grandma and is trying to get over the events of the previous Poltergeist. Most of the cast is back in this one, except for the lady who had played the older sister. Now, she does not get any mention in this movie, so I was curious as to what had happened to her. You guys, this is going to bring us right away to talking about the Poltergeist curse. Yes, friends, the people involved in the making of the Poltergeist movies tend to die in real life, and shortly after Poltergeist came out, that actress passed away unexpectedly. So she's not available for Poltergeist 2. Creepy stuff, and obviously our hearts go out to her family, who that must have been a terrible time for. As far as the movie itself, Craig T. Nelson keeps this movie grounded, just as he did in the first one. Playing the dad, he brings a real human aspect to it. This movie is kind of fun. It is not really a haunted house movie, as the first one was, as the haunting is sort of a little bit more general. This movie adds to the mythology an evil preacher who had apparently, who had led people to their deaths on that spot from the first Poltergeist, and is now trying to guide his flock to the other side, but evilly. I'm not sure. I did not like anthropomorphizing the evil. I liked it better when it was a little bit more vague. So boo to the preacher. Still, kind of a fun movie. I did sort of enjoy watching it, even though it is certainly not a very good movie. Poltergeist 2, 2.5 stars. Yes, you guys, you're getting a double dose of Horror Hound this week because we're going to keep on going with Poltergeist 3. And the Poltergeist curse, I'm sorry to say, kept going as the guy that played the preacher in Poltergeist 2 died between Poltergeist 2 and 3. And I should mention, Dominique Dunne is the name of the actress who passed away between Poltergeist 1 and 2. Now, guys, the only person to return for Poltergeist 3 is the little girl. The "They're here" girl is the only one who came back. That's Heather O'Rourke. And guys, I am really sorry to tell you, she dies after they made Poltergeist 3. She ended up having a rare condition, and even though she was just a little girl, she passed away, which is very sad. She was very proud of these movies, and I think she should be proud of her work in them, as she's, even as a child actress, is a really solid part of these and a welcome presence again in Poltergeist 3. She was so proud of these, in fact, that to this day her headstone reads that she was the star of the Poltergeist series. So tip of the hat to Heather O'Rourke, without whom this movie wouldn't be half of what it is. Now, Poltergeist 3, I would say it's a strong, starts out strong, finishes kind of lame. In this one, the little girl, Heather O'Rourke, has been sent to live with her aunt and uncle in a skyrise. Now we got us a haunted skyrise, which I kind of like the idea of. We replaced the family with Tom Skerritt and Nancy Allen, both of whom I like quite a bit. You also have Lara Flynn Boyle as the, well, I guess she's not the older sister, the older cousin. You might remember her from Twin Peaks. Well, she and Heather O'Rourke disappear about halfway through the movie, and then Tom and Nancy have to anchor it, and they do a pretty good job. Like I say, this one really peters out at the end, but I would say it was about as enjoyable as Poltergeist 2, which is why I'm giving it also 2.5 stars. All right, guys, let's move things ahead with a Hollywood classic. This week, we are looking at The Stranger, one of the only dozen or so movies directed by the great Orson Welles. This movie comes on, this is after he had done Citizen Kane and The Magnificent Ambersons. Here, he's making a movie largely to show the studios that he can make something on time and on budget. As a result, what you end up with is a strong and well-made movie. Welles also acts in it, but Welles seems sort of uninterested. He hasn't putting quite the same panache and innovation into this one that he had into those earlier masterpieces, resulting in a movie that is interesting but does feel, more like a job for Welles, which is what it was. He really wanted to prove something here, and I'm sad to say that even though he did bring this movie in on time and under budget, the studio did not follow through on their promise to let him make more movies for them. So what's this movie about? It's Welles plays a Nazi who is living in a small American town, hiding out under an assumed name, trying to not get found out. Enter in an FBI dude who thinks he's figured it out and is trying to expose Welles. And Welles, meanwhile, is about to get married to his American fiancée. She finds out what's going on, etc. As you can kind of tell from my needing to throw out a few different characters there, a big problem with The Stranger is that it lacks a strong protagonist. At no point is really Welles or his fiancée or the FBI guy, that strong of a character. And I wish that they had been. And what I think would have been interesting is I read online doing some research here that Welles actually wanted Agnes Moorehead to be the FBI agent. And I think that could have been an exciting twist. Welles had worked with Moorehead in both Kane and Ambersons, and Moorehead even won an Oscar for The Magnificent Ambersons. So casting that role sort of against type with Agnes Moorehead, I think could have been a really interesting choice that would have livened up the whole picture. And if you're kind of fuzzy on who Agnes Moorehead is, real quick, you would know her. She played Endora on Bewitched. So yes, that means that Bewitched's own Endora is an Academy Award winner. As stands, The Stranger is certainly fine. It just doesn't live up to the heights of some of Welles' other pictures. 3 stars. It's time for nobody's favorite part of the show. This is the worst of the week. This week's worst of the week is Body Rock. Longtime viewers of the show will remember that I listen to a number of movie-based podcasts, including the very popular How Did This Get Made, a movie or a podcast where they talk about bad movies. They recently talked about Body Rock, which means I watched Body Rock. This is a movie where Lorenzo Lamas decides he needs to become a breakdancer so he can make it big in the local club scene. And I did not care for Body Rock. It is a boring and uninspired movie. In many ways, it feels like sort of a male Showgirls in that it centers around, in this case, Lorenzo Lamas as a character trying to break into show business through these very elaborate dance sequences. This movie is also somewhat racially problematic in that Lorenzo Lamas does not start the movie as a breakdancer or somebody who really cares about breakdancing. He merely sees breakdancing as a means to an end and convinces a young African-American boy named Magic, who is a great breakdancer and breathes and loves and lives breakdancing. Lorenzo Lamas convinces Magic to teach him how to breakdance, and then he uses those moves to get the jobs without ever crediting Magic for them. So, #problematic. Yeah, and that kind of sums up my problem with the movie. Like, it's another movie that has a big protagonist problem where it's not like you like Lorenzo Lamas, you're not rooting for him. Ultimately what I'm saying is this: Body Rock is no Breakin' 2 Electric Boogaloo. So what is Body Rock? It's about 1.5 stars. All right, that's enough Body Rock. Let's break dance over to the best of the bunch. This week's best of the bunch is Manhunter. Now this is an older picture. This is one coming to us from the 80s, and it is an all-time favorite of mine that I revisited recently, and I'm super excited to say that it is still tremendous. Directed by the great Michael Mann, Manhunter is, if you would probably know it better by the name Red Dragon, because that's what they remade it as. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself, friends. So Manhunter is an adaptation of the Thomas Harris novel Red Dragon, which is the first of the Hannibal Lecter novels. Now, this movie came out well before Silence of the Lambs, and is the first Hannibal Lecter movie. It was later remade by, I think, Brett Ratner as Red Dragon. But the movie we're talking about is Manhunter, the first attempt at all of this. I would say it's the best of the Lecter movies. I love it a lot. In this one, we don't have Anthony Hopkins as Hannibal Lecter. Instead, we have Brian Cox playing Hannibal Lecter, and Brian does a tremendous job. His Lecter is very different from Anthony Hopkins. Hopkins plays him as, very refined and intelligent, while Brian Cox brings a much more reptilian and predatory sense to Lecter in the very few Lecter scenes. Lecter is very much a side supporting character in this. You call this a Hannibal Lecter movie because Hannibal Lecter is such a big character, but it's not a Hannibal Lecter movie. He certainly doesn't headline. He's certainly not the bad guy. No, instead this movie follows the detective who's trying to track down a serial killer. The detective's played by Tom Noonan. And Tom had prior to this movie just caught Lecter and gone to some very dark places in his own psyche to do so. Now he's been called out of retirement to try and solve another murder. This one being committed by a guy called the Tooth Fairy. Here's the deal. This is a great movie. It's very stylish. Michael Mann bathes this whole thing in neon and synth. He also wisely turns it into a procedural, so that most of this movie is following the detective. The character's name is Will Graham. Following him as he tracks down the Tooth Fairy, using Lecter to do so. Getting Lecter to sort of bait the Tooth Fairy from behind bars a little bit, but at the same time, Graham has to sort of start to try and see things that the way the killer would in order to catch him. It's super stylish. I love the procedural elements. There's a particularly great sequence that I think a lot of viewers would find boring, where they discover a letter written on toilet paper by the Tooth Fairy to Hannibal Lecter in Lecter's cell. They grab it and then they run it through this whole barrage of tests at the police laboratory where they're like x-raying it and bathing it in UV and trying to figure out where it's from and who sent it, that I find very exciting. The other great part of this movie is Joan Allen. Joan isn't in it a lot, but she plays a blind woman who works in the same development laboratory as our archvillain, the Tooth Fairy. And she goes out on a date with him, wherein we find out that the Tooth Fairy is maybe a little bit redeemable. He takes her out on this great date where he takes her to a zoo veterinarian's office, and she gets to pet and feel a sedated tiger, which, just those sort of textures and the power. Allen plays it so well where you can get the sense of how amazing that would be, not just for you or I, but for a blind person to be able to feel all of that and have those sensations. She's great in the movie, and she's great when the killer ultimately turns against her, as you would expect. This is a tremendous, suspenseful, and stylish movie. If you've never seen it, if you've only seen Silence of the Lambs and its sequels, I really think you owe it to yourself to go back and check out Manhunter. It is a tip-top movie for me, and I'm giving it 5 stars. That's going to do it for Every Movie Ever. I've been Eric. Thanks so much for watching. We'll be back next time as we try to review every movie ever made.